right, how's it going, everyone? Thanks for joining me on a new episode of the Music Reviewer Podcast. My name's Josh, and today's going to be a new album review for you guys. This is going to be episode 60. The title of the album is Jubilee by the artist Japanese Breakfast, and it was released on June 4th of this year. And yeah, I was just trying to get to this one quickly, usually a bit more quick than I do my usual album reviews after the album has been released. So, been listening to this all week, and it's time to review it. And yeah, pretty excited to be covering Japanese Breakfast. They're an artist that I've been listening to for a few years now, an artist whose music I really dig for the most part. I've actually seen them live as well a couple of years ago before the pandemic hit. So, good times. And before we get started, just want to let everyone know a new episode of Best and Worst Track of the Week did drop not too long ago for the week of June 5th. At this point, it's a bit of old news, but it was Polo G and Lil Wayne got Best Track of the Week versus Jonas Brothers and Marshmello. The Polo G and Lil Wayne track was pretty decent. I thought it was a good collab. The Jonas Brothers Marshmello thing, not so much. If you're interested in my thoughts on those tracks by those artists, go ahead and listen to that episode of Best and Worst Track of the Week. It's probably the most previous episode prior to this one that you're listening to now. But I also covered some tracks from Lil Durk, A Boogie with the Hoodie, 42 Doug, Future, Lil Nas X, City Girls, Olivia Rodrigo. This is actually the Olivia Rodrigo album bomb episode. So if you want some thoughts right now about the Olivia Rodrigo Sour album, from me at least, you're going to be getting it on this episode of Best and Worst Track of the Week. For now, I'm probably going to drop the album review after this one. And then also there's a track by BTS there. So yeah, it was a pretty nice, diverse episode of Best and Worst Track of the Week there. And of course, another one will be dropping shortly after this episode of the podcast. And of course, if you're been listening, keeping up, thanks for doing that. But also, if it seems like there's been a big break between album reviews, sorry about that. But yeah, it's kind of true. But I did it really just to experiment with something. I dropped an EP review only on the YouTube side only. An EP that I was really hoping to cover, and I'm glad I got around to it. It was the latest Sam Gelatry EP titled 4. That I thought was just a solid batch of tracks, and I really think it's a nice, solid effort with him kind of pushing the boundaries of what he's capable of doing, because he's been primarily, I guess, electronic music producer. Hasn't really delved into like the whole vocals thing and making pop songs, but I guess on this sort of deal he did, and it came out really nice in my opinion. So go ahead. If you're on the YouTube side, you'll see this, but also just search the music reviewer Sam Gelatry, or if you know where the channel is, you'll see it there if you're interested in checking that review out. But nonetheless, without further ado, let's go ahead and get to the gist of this album review. Alright, so I was saying earlier, the album I'm covering is Jubilee by the artist Japanese Breakfast, the indie rock, indie pop band fronted by Korean-American musician, director, and author Michelle Ozoner. If I'm saying that wrong, I'm sorry. This is a really cool band. They kind of been hanging around since like the mid-2010s, and the band has origins from Philadelphia, or I guess that area of the country. However, Michelle was raised in Oregon, and the band officially released their debut album in 2016 titled Psycho Pomp. Before going by Japanese Breakfast, actually, Michelle, the front woman, or person, also had a project titled Little Big League, which was described as having an emo sound. A couple of tracks for that project actually ended up becoming Japanese Breakfast songs. They were titled American Sound and Where's My Great Big Feeling. I read a little bit about that, and I guess they were tracks that were part of like this cool thing that was happening on Tumblr at the time. I don't know if anyone remembers Tumblr. Those tracks were this sort of, I guess, collaboration thing that I guess Japanese Breakfast was doing with other artists around the time and releasing certain things to Bandcamp. I think those tracks ended up becoming Japanese Breakfast tracks that way. So yeah, always pretty interesting when you can learn a little bit of history from the tracks. And I probably discovered Japanese Breakfast around the time they were making quite a bit of buzz in around 2017. The track Machinist was probably my first introduction at some point, with other tracks like Roadhead coming soon after. And I was quite captivated with how sensible and punchy the bass grooves on those tracks were, and how they were implemented, and how naturally hooky those tracks are as well. And that's a good recipe for me to really like a track, honestly. And a lot of Japanese breakfast music has that sort of thing. They also have like this dream pop, and then indie rock grittiness at times. But the music really is a hodgepodge, especially on their release in 2017 titled Soft Sounds from Another Planet. A lot of tracks sound different, just going track to track on the album. There isn't one concise, I guess, consistent aesthetic going on. And then also another nice quality about Japanese breakfast music is Michelle's voice also has like this distinct wailing nature at times, that I think is like a signature sound that I found to be pretty interesting as well. But yeah, that's pretty. I did know this album, Jubilee, was coming out. Maybe I just wasn't anticipating it like quite heavily, but I was excited when I finally learned this came out a few days ago. So what like I do on most album reviews, I like going back to the most recent album or body of work, and I guess it ended up being my favorite album from the artist thus far. It was Soft Sounds from Another Planet. Obviously, that was probably my first introduction to the band, so I'm a bit biased. But some thoughts about that album. It opens up with the track Diving Woman, a track that is structured by like this ostinato bass melody and an accompanying thin guitar riff repeating over and over again. It's a track that really demonstrates what is normal when it comes to a Japanese breakfast track. Also, Roadhead is similar in a sense to Diving Woman with how it's composed, but it's a bit poppier and maybe hookier stylistically. Also, it's probably one of the first tracks I heard from this artist as well. The track overall creates a nice, dreamy atmosphere that captivates all throughout. Machinist is a great tune coming after Roadhead on this album that presents a quirkiness to the album that really helps Japanese breakfast remain distinct to some contemporaries, in my opinion. It's a track that's quite fitting in many circumstances. Like you can put this track on like at a party maybe, or just when you're driving alone in your car, or whatever you're doing laundry or something. The track, in my opinion, is just that versatile. And in my opinion, also remains quite unique to this day. I've never really quite heard a track that sounds like pre-hyper pop while blending in to a pretty standard dream pop playlist. But that track does. 12 Steps is another track that featured some more classic indie rock norms with some gritty guitar tones and an actual guitar solo. It could probably pass for an early Death Cab for Cutie track, maybe. It was a nice rediscovering this track too. I'm really glad I went back to this album. Also, the track "The Body Is a Blade" is a nice cut that has some colorful synths incorporated to the track, and the overall build up to the track's ultimate ending is a nice experience too. So overall, I thought this was a solid project. Like I said, it was my first introduction to the band. I know there's a debut album before that that I'm not too familiar with, but I've heard some songs from it. But I will say I really dig Soft Sounds from Another Planet, and I guess if I'm comparing it to a new project such as Jubilee, I was going for maybe, some high expectations or maybe something a little bit more consistent with what was presented there. Now, there is a pretty decent gap between Jubilee, which is in 2021 right now, and Soft Sounds from Another Planet in 2017. So obviously I didn't expect there to be the same album, basically done again. There are quite a bit of stark differences from this previous project and this new one here, Jubilee. And these two albums are similar in the sense that Jubilee does go for like the hodgepodge of styles. Each track kind of sounds different for the most part, and it's not just like one huge, I guess, homogenous style just being changed up a bit track to track. So I can't say that Jubilee is a bit of a more refreshing experience. It's not the same album regurgitated. So I will say that this album is original in that sense. And there are some newer, fresher ideas coming into the discography of Japanese Breakfast. Starting from the track Paprika, there is some lush, fuzzy synths to open the track. I love the layered harmonized vocals as they come in and out of this track. The texture of the swift drum track is quite nice as well. It kind of makes me think back to like early Sufjan Stevens with the strings and the horns being implemented. Tracks like Chicago. The track is a bit different for Japanese Breakfast stylistically. It's not a track that I would think would blend into the previous album, honestly. So immediately there, we're getting a refreshing sound that I think works. Paprika is a great track. Be Sweet is probably one of my favorite tracks coming off of this, if not my favorite. We get a bouncy and agile bass track guiding the track over some new wave inspired instrumentals. Love the danciness on this track. Some more of those layered harmonized vocals coming in and out tastefully, almost like a New Order track or a Depeche Mode track with how it's sounding. The hookiness of the line, I want to believe in you, that line grows the more and more it's implemented. Also some bright keyboard melodies down the track. And yeah, overall this track makes the album stronger in my opinion. The track after that is a bit of a different direction, Kokomo /IN or IN. This track definitely has a more relaxed breeziness to it. There's a mid-tempo groove guided by the drum track. There's some slide guitar that's going on with some chirpy articulation in the strings on that chorus. With a sort of like an Americana twang to it, some light country influence maybe. I thought it was an interesting direction. I'm definitely not digging as much as the previous two tracks, but I thought the track was interesting. The track after that, Slide Tackle, I thought was a highlight. This track features more of the bass-driven typical songwriting that's normally found on Japanese Breakfast tracks. Digging how smooth the transition to the chorus is on here. The syncopated drum groove that structures this chorus as well is quite nice. The fuzzy sax solo we get is quite fitting. Love the running guitar lines that appear on the second verse. The track develops and progresses the more and more it goes on, and it becomes quite captivating, colorful as more textures are being added on. And then, of course, we get some lovely horn sections on this track as well. The track after that, Posing in Bondage, didn't really think too much of it, other than it's obviously a more slow-paced and ambient track with some 80s flavor to it, with the percussive bell sounds typical of the era. It reminds me a bit of like maybe a Wild Nothing track on certain points, but it was an interesting track overall. The track after that, Sit, I found to be quite interesting. It opens up with a deep, heavy synth presence or something like that. A bit distorted, grainy, and dirty. I dig the overall color that's thrown on this. Not sure how I dig the contrasting section, but I do end up liking it when we return to the more developed like second verse. That's quite nice. It's not bad. I actually like the track a bit more the second or third time around. The track after that, Savage Good Boy, I'm digging the punchiness and drive of the eighth note chord progression structure in the track. The track is paced out quite nicely. Dig the implementation of the piano on here. Every time the piano is used, it's spaced out, and there's value to every time a note is played. Interesting dueling guitar section thrown in. I dug that area. And this track kind of just reminds me a bit of like a Broken Social Scene track. It's a bit short, but it's not bad. I would have liked if the album overall went in more of that direction. And then after this, the album takes a sort of like a more lighter turn. For instance, the track In Hell to me felt a bit sleepy. The light keyboard melody can make this feel obviously leaning more on the lighter side. It's same with like the clean guitar textures, but the track overall is not bad. Tactics, I found to be a bit sleepy overall too. This track is a bit of like another breezy and relaxed tune. I like that the album is keeping things consistent with like the string and instrumentation on this track as well. But on this track, at times that can be a bit redundant and predictable. Not sure really what to think on this track, to be honest. It wasn't bad though. And then we kind of get like a head scratcher at the end, posing for cars. I'm digging the exposed, dissonant sounding acoustic and clean guitars that open everything up. And the track does stand out in the context of the album. And I think this track could have worked. It has maybe more of like a Midwest emo type of aesthetic on here, which kind of makes sense knowing that there's a emo background to the Japanese Breakfast story. But we kind of get thrown into this jammy and chaotic like outro that's held together by some pretty steady drum and bass work. But it really just didn't feel as grandiose than I think it was trying to be. For instance, that sort of thing happens on the closing track of like the latest Phoebe Bridgers album, but that really did it quite well. They really went overkill on that grandiose ending. I'm not sure if this was trying to do that, but it certainly felt like it was trying to go for a similar ending. But that was just a bit of a head scratcher. Overall, I think this album is good. I really dug it, and I'm glad this work exists. There's some decent highlights on here that I'm definitely going to go back to. Paprika, Be Sweet, maybe Slide Tackle here and there. Savage Good Boy, I really dug as well. I would like to hear Japanese Breakfast maybe go more in that direction as well. And then overall, there's some interesting points on here that I thought were really cool to see all throughout, like the Americana influence on Kokomo IN with the breeziness and relaxed nature that comes on and a few more times on the album. Also, the strings and horns being featured on many tracks I thought were nice and a good way to expand, I guess, the overall sound palette on these Japanese Breakfast tracks. For instance, it really didn't show up as much on the previous album, so seeing this implemented more makes me think that the sound is really trying to be matured or just done from a different angle. So that can be appreciated there. And so overall it's a solid album. Don't know if I appreciate it more than of some other records that I recently reviewed. And if I had to rate it, I'd give it a 6 out of 10. I don't know if I'm digging it more than the Spirit of the Beehive album, but I can definitely say it's more solid in my opinion than the most recent, Brockhampton album, even though those are two completely different genres. I'm just throwing that out there. But yeah, good album from Japanese Breakfast. Still super excited to see what happens next with this act and more music to come. And I think most people that are into the band are going to enjoy this album. Probably if you're into dream pop and indie pop and that sort of realm, you're going to take a few things that you're from this album that you're going to like. I'm not sure other than that. I'm not sure who this album's for. If they were to expand their fan base, who is going to come into this really liking it, but I'm sure there's stuff that are going to appeal to most people if they just give it the chance. So yeah, good album. And if you stuck with me to the end of the review, my name's Josh. Thanks for listening. If you're on YouTube, like and subscribe. Leave a comment, good or bad. Also, if you're on your preferred streaming service, subscribe there too. But anyways, take care of yourselves. I'll see y'all later.